I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's Legacies program with Judy Heumann and Bill Abrams. Legacies, it's made possible with a gift from Mark Kirshner in honor of Nancy Fisher. Judy Heumann is one of the most influential disability rights activists in US history, helping spark the movement that led to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. Judy was actually at the White House yesterday celebrating the 31st anniversary of the ADA. Judy's story was recently told in the documentary Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution, which is currently streaming on Netflix. And it was just announced this week that she'll also be featured in a new Apple original film starring Ali Stroker. Judy also runs The Human Perspective, a terrific podcast available on Apple and Spotify, which we encourage you to check out. Judy also recently published a memoir, Being Heumann, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist. You can order the book and check out some of Judy's other work at the link in the Zoom chat. Judy will be in conversation today with Bill Abrams, the president of Trickle Up. Bill was previously the president of New York Times Television and vice president of business development for ABC News. Among his many projects, he was the executive producer of the 1997 PBS documentary, The Trial of Adolf Eichmann. We're honored to have both of them with us today. Please feel free to share questions in the Zoom Q&A box as they chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Without further ado, welcome Judy and Bill. Feel free to get started.
Thank you, Ari, and it's a real pleasure to be here. The Museum of Jewish Heritage is about a mile walk from my house. I've been there many times. It's a great institution, so I'm very pleased to be part of this event. And very pleased to again share a stage, virtual or otherwise, with my good friend Judy Heumann. We've known each other, I guess, about a dozen years, maybe longer.
Yeah.
Friends, professional colleagues in different settings. I always learn from Judy, and I know you will today as well. Our format.
And vice versa.
Okay.
I always learn from Bill.
Our format today, Judy and I will have a conversation for about 40 minutes, give or take. And then we want to make sure there's time for your questions and discussion. I would encourage everyone to go ahead at any time and put your questions into the chat function, and we may weave some of them into the conversation. We'll kind of go with the flow. So I hope everybody knows, I think it's down there on the bottom of your screen, how to insert questions. There will also be an opportunity to do some on camera or whatever. So with that, we will get started. And I have no idea how many of you have read Judy's autobiography, Being Heumann, which I hold up. If you haven't read it, you should. And I want to quote the very first line, which was, quote, "I never wished I didn't have a disability." Now, when I read this book a number of months ago, I was surprised by that line, and I'm sure it would surprise many of you in our audience. So Judy, tell us what you meant by that statement. I never wished I didn't have a disability.
Yeah, I mean, I had polio in 1949, and my disability is a part of who I am. And so I think in many ways, I've really looked at my life and the lives of my friends and others with disabilities as not one where we have to become non-disabled, but where people need to see us as a part of the structure of our societies, and that changes need to be made, which enable us to be included in all aspects of life. And I think, as I got older, I've really, looked at medical research, which is focusing on curing people so that they don't have their disabilities. And, polio is polio. It's a virus that came and it went, and it left you as you are. And I just really have felt that people not accepting me and other disabled people for who we are means that somewhere people have this vision that we'll live in a world where there are no disabled people. And even if we were to eradicate every form of disability, which comes from cancer or COVID or whatever it may be, we still, on a regular basis, are causing disability, whether it's through famine or war or other forms of violence. So disabled people are here to stay. And for me, it's much better to invest my time and others in allowing society to recognize that disability is a normal part of life and that we need to address the barriers that are man-made.
Thank you. So as Ari mentioned, yesterday was the 31st anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act by President George H.W. Bush. And you were at a ceremony yesterday with President Biden and Vice President Harris to mark this historic event. Can you give us a short explanation of how the ADA Act defines disability, how it differs from the old medical model of disability, and why this legislation, now 30 years old, was and remains so important? I guess that's a three-part question.
So I will try to remember all aspects and you'll tell me what I'm not answering.
Okay.
You know, first of all, the definition of disability, one could say, is a medical definition. It's a disability is something which limits one or more major life activities. And it can be caused by, you know, every kind of disability. And disability defined by the ADA is also if someone is perceived of as having a disability. So you can look at it this way. One who has a disability, physical, intellectual, invisible, with mental health, diabetes, lupus, on, and some disabilities which may start out invisible and then may become visible, like MS and Parkinson's, etc. And if one, so that's one group. And then let's say that you have a friend or a sibling or a partner who has a disability, and it might have been AIDS. So we saw, you know, certainly in the 90s, where someone who was closely related to somebody who had AIDS might be being denied a job because of the belief that they would be spreaders. And even though they didn't have AIDS, which would have covered them, they could be denied a job. So they could file a complaint. So I think, you know, when we look at who we are, it's very broad. Limiting one or more life activities is very broad. And we know that according to CDC, 1 in 4 people now have a disability in the United States. Now, you know, disabilities are from very significant to much less significant. And so the definition comes into play if you believe that you've been discriminated against in a way that disability was the cause of that discrimination. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, so talk a little bit more about the ADA Act itself, the Americans with Disability Act, and why it was so important, and how is it important today? It was important in 1990, and I believe it's still important. So
I think the way to look at it is the Civil Rights Act of 64. Right? We look at the Civil Rights Act of 64 as important still today, because there's so many things that have not yet been realized. It's the same thing with the ADA. I mean, it took us, because disability was not a part of the Civil Rights Act of 64. So it basically took us 26 years to be able to have comparable legislation. And it's important because, well, many people look at issues around discrimination and disability as physical barriers. The disability community looks at it much more broadly, as does the law. So employment, for example, Title I is a very important part of the ADA. Prior to the ADA, we had Section 504 and a couple of other provisions, but they didn't cover the private sector. So the Americans with Disabilities Act covers the private sector, which means that buildings which are being built, theaters which are being constructed, schools, etc. Well, schools were covered earlier, but shopping malls, movie theaters, not only have to be accessible, but can't discriminate in the area of employment. And technology is something that was mentioned in the ADA, but now that technology is playing a much bigger role, you can see how things like captioning and audio descriptions are becoming much more prevalent for a variety of reasons. But the ADA, I think, broadly speaking, acknowledges that disabled people are a part of the fabric of the United States. And by passing this law and making it illegal to discriminate based on disability, really stipulates that the society recognize that the barriers that have been placed before us as disabled people were not enabling us to live our lives in an equitable way. And so the law itself basically is, as President Bush said, the Emancipation Proclamation in the disability community. And why is it important today? It's important today because while we've made progress, we certainly have not ameliorated many of the barriers that disabled people face. And again, it's not just the physical barriers. So I think I do a lot of public speaking and I speak to a lot of businesses. And many companies now are setting up either ERGs or affinity groups, and they've had them for many years for many different groups. But the disability community, you're seeing more and more of these companies have either the ERGs or the affinity groups. Typically, the disability ones are the last that have come into being. And it's interesting to talk with people from these both businesses and larger companies that could be nonprofits about how they are basically, I think, coming together, recognizing that their opportunities within the entity that they're working in are still not on par with other people within the companies, that there's still bias in recruitment and hiring, in retention and advancement, and that the culture of these organizations still is not changing in a significant enough way that disabled employees or family members who have disabled people in their families feel that they can disclose. I think one of the huge issues is that there are many disabled individuals with invisible disabilities and not even invisible disabilities who don't want to disclose, who don't want to identify. I mean, I was talking to a company today that has about 30,000 employees. And out of 30,000 employees, they did a survey, and I think 900 people identified as having a disability. And one of the people who is a part of this group has a stutter and did not define himself as having a disability. And I think by the end of our discussion, I hopefully made him feel that it's okay to identify as having a disability. I think, there's such a stigma. I just did a BBC interview with people, about 4 other people from different countries. And this issue of stigma is everywhere. And so not identifying, not speaking up and out about who we are, not identifying as having a disability, I think is something which is internationally pervasive. And bringing this back to the Jewish community, I think it's fair to say that we're no different than any other group. I want to say also that I feel like over the last 10 years or so, there really has been more focus on looking at opportunities for us to really bring the voice of disabled people forward within the community, the Rudiman Foundation and others who have supported and nurtured, like February as National Disability Jewish Awareness and Inclusion Month. I am not a big one on months or days, but I think really it's been valuable for those religious institutions that have taken it seriously to really look more in depth at what they're doing. And I think equally important, talking to disabled people within the religious community about what we actually feel about what's going on.
Great. Thank you. We'll come back to that a little bit later as well, the role of the Jewish community. One question that came up, let me ask two questions that have to do with language. We had a question in the chat box from Tanya Barnett, who asks, do you like the label disability, the actual word? What about using differently able as it's more positive?
I hate differently abled.
Because?
I mean, everybody's differently able. What does that mean? I mean, Bill and I, he's different than I am, so we're differently able. I hate using the word able. I hate the presumption that we're having to say that disability means not able. I am not able to walk. That is a fact. Nothing will change that fact. But from a political perspective, I don't want to be aligned with a group called differently abled. From a political point of view, I want us to be seen as an important voting constituency. I want us to be seen as an important group of people, as I was discussing, in the area of employment, community integration, religious life, etc. And I've used the word disabled since like the late 1960s. And this debate about terminology has gone on way before that, but certainly has been a front and center issue for decades. And I feel a little more confident than ever that more and more disabled people are wanting to just say the word and move beyond it. And so some people feel comfortable with disabled people. Some people like people with disabilities. I really want to discourage people from using all these other euphemisms, which in my view, basically are terms that non-disabled people have created. And nobody else plays around with any other group. The women doesn't say women are not men. I mean, there are all these words that we can take apart and be critical of. The word disabled means an inability to do something, not necessarily completely, but in a limited way. But the bottom line is, it isn't the totality of who I am. And it isn't the totality of who anyone is. And so leave the word alone, stop fighting on this issue of the word and get down to substance of making the meaningful changes that need to be made. Don't tell me what I should call myself.
Okay. So another language question, I guess. Ableism, which is a term that one often hears in discussions of disability. It may be less familiar to people who are in those circles. What is ableism?
I mean, the word that was used before is handicapism. And I would say that handicapism never got the prominence that ableism has gotten, but ableism is basically, in my view, looking at the biases that non-disabled people have in trying to get us to conform to being non-disabled or able-bodied. And it's, you know, we can get into much more in-depth discussion around it, but ableism is really a denial of our rights. It's an expression of it's racism, sexism. It's the same theoretical background in utilizing that word. Ableist, ableism.
Thank you. So we're going to shift gears here a little bit. And as this event is being held, at least virtually, at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, its full name also includes a living memorial to the Holocaust. Let's talk about the Shoah, which figures prominently in your own family biography. Both of your parents came to the United States from Germany in the 1930s, sent by their parents who later perished in the Shoah. So how do you look back on all that as well as the fact that some of the very earliest victims of what became Hitler's mass genocide were disabled children. It's almost where he started in a sense. So how do you look back at the Holocaust, both personally and more globally or more universally?
Well, I think more globally and universally, we look at the fact that it took quite a while for people to recognize what was being done to disabled children in the beginning of the Holocaust, and one's value for the life of disabled people. And I think you could see this in COVID starting last year, when policies were coming out that were attempting to prioritize non-disabled people as being more valuable to provide medical interventions and medical technology like respirators, and where disabled individuals could have, if the policies wouldn't have been fought against, really resulted even more disabled people losing their lives. And in some cases, states were looking at taking respirators away from disabled individuals who normally use them to give them to other people. So I think, the issue of the value of the disabled person's life is really something that continues to be questioned. And that's a large part of what it is that, the disability community is saying, is that our lives need to be as valued as the lives of non-disabled people. For me personally, how did the Holocaust play out in my life? I would say that my parents, like many others, had to be resilient to be able to really come through these terrible tragedies. My father and my mother's story is a little bit different because my mother was an only child and she was sent to live with distant relatives that she didn't know. And they were all, much older than my mother. And of course, she, like many others, anticipated seeing her parents sometime in the future, and that never happened. My dad was sent to live with relatives in Brooklyn. My mother was sent to Chicago. And my father's 3 brothers all got out. And so he was with uncle and other relatives in Brooklyn in a small community. So it was different. The tragedy was equal, but the fact that they had family supports. But I think, my dad was in the Marines in Carlson's Raiders, and he and my mother met in Philadelphia when he was home on leave and he was visiting his brother, and my mother was visiting a distant relative in Philadelphia. And, their story is great because their story is all through letters, including my father proposing and my mother accepting, and then my father going out to meet the woman that he was, the relative that she was living with. When they got married and they moved to Brooklyn, and I was born in 47, and I had polio in 49. When I was about 2 years old, I learned when I was 36 that a doctor had recommended my parents put me in an institution. And I think, that story, even today, is one which is unfortunately not uncommon. My presumption is that A, my parents never told me because they didn't want me to know, and B, that they wouldn't have done something like that because of the history of what went on in Nazi Germany with disabled kids and the Holocaust in general. So, they early on made a decision that I was a part of the family and they were going to treat me like they treated my brothers who came after me. And I think this, resilience really played a pivotal role in my parents never accepting no. Mm-hmm. So they had expectations of what their responsibilities were. Teacher, your responsibility, as my parents would say, is you're to go to school to learn, and that's your job. Our job is to work and support you. You need to learn. But when I couldn't go to school because my mom took me to school and the principal denied me the right to go to school, and there was no law that said he couldn't do that. And when he said, "Don't worry, Mrs. Heumann, the Board of Ed in New York will send a teacher to your house for 2.5 hours a week," which of course he didn't add. My parents clearly understood that that was not equal. And they were trying to get me into a school. And this is in the book, but what happened was my mom then tried to enroll me in a Jewish day school. And so I was in kindergarten. And the principal told my mother, I couldn't go to the school because I didn't know enough Hebrew. So what did that mean? It meant I needed to learn Hebrew. My parents didn't speak Hebrew. So our physical therapist's wife was from Israel. And I don't know how many days a week my mother took me to their place to learn Hebrew. And then she called the principal and said, "My daughter knows enough Hebrew." Well, my mother at that point really didn't get that he was not saying I needed to learn more Hebrew. He was saying no, using that as an excuse. And numbers of incidents over my life have occurred like that. But I think what I learned from them when I was younger is you just keep moving forward. You kind of keep plodding through. And I think my mother was always a networker. My father, being a butcher, he was a networker also, because, you're always talking to customers. And that's really how I grew up. It's looking at, okay, there will be no's, but we don't accept no. And so what do you do to reverse the no's? And I think that's really a very important part about the results of the Holocaust. It's, in spite of the tragedies, how people were able to continue to come together and fight to move forward. So I think it is very much a part of a result of my parents' experiences.
So you had these amazing sounding parents who were determined and fierce advocates on your behalf. Not everyone has parents like that. Maybe you could talk about the role of allies, advocates, people who are on your side, because if you have a prominent disability, you are always facing obstacles and challenges as you have in your life, and it's hard, I'm sure, to go it alone. So what are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I never felt like I was alone. I think, A, because of my parents, and B, when I finally started meeting other disabled children and later adults, I was seeing that, and first learned. So I went from home instruction to public school in a regular building, but the classes that I were in were only for disabled kids. The learning was terrible. And actually, at one point, my parents thought of taking me out of the program and putting me back on home instruction because I was learning so little, but they decided the socialization was very important. But what I was learning was that the parents of my friends also were concerned, and that the parents working together. So this whole theme of networking, it's not that all the parents were doing this, but there were enough parents who really, Jewish and non-Jewish, felt that they wanted their kids to be able to succeed in life and that education was important. And so at that point in time, if you had a physical disability and couldn't walk up steps, you went back onto home instruction for high school. So my mother and many other mothers primarily basically fought the Board of Ed, never went to court, but had meetings with the Board of Ed and got them to make some of the high schools accessible and to provide transportation for us to go to those high schools like they had been providing for elementary school, and to have support staff in the schools if people needed assistance, like going to the bathroom or getting from class to class or whatever. So that really enabled me to be meeting other disabled people in high school. I started going to camp when I was 9. Before I went to Camp Jeanette, I went to a camp called Oakhurst. And, there's this interesting discussion about being in segregated environments versus integrated environments. And I think from an educational perspective and an employment perspective, certainly things should always be inclusive. But the ability to bring people with similar backgrounds and interests together in a camp situation is something that I think is important. I think it's important for people in the area of disability, just giving my own personal experiences. And if you've seen or watched Crip Camp, you'll see that there is both a spoken and unspoken camaraderie, not from everybody to everybody, but it was really valuable to be able to be in a community where other people understood what you meant when we were talking about discrimination, what you meant how you felt about not being able to get on a bus or not being able to go across the street or not getting the same kinds of support in thinking about where your careers were going to go, or not knowing other disabled people in careers, because we didn't see many disabled people in jobs at all. And it really enabled us to begin to also look at other movements. So I would say the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the aging movement, the anti-war movement, and television were something that was very, very important, because we were beginning to see and understand as we were getting older what the civil rights movement, for example, and other movements really meant. It was the voices of people coming together in a unified way in expressing opposition to how they were being treated. And certainly looking at the civil rights movement, integration of schools, and on, there were terrible things that were happening to people that we were seeing and reading about, people dying for their beliefs and their fight for justice. So that was all very important as our movement has been evolving. And I think, we talk about the effect of institutions. We still have not yet been speaking enough and requiring that society itself see the role that is played in the untimely deaths of thousands and probably hundreds of thousands of people over generations. People that were placed in institutions because of mental health disabilities or intellectual disabilities or physical disabilities or combinations of all the above. And it's kind of a story like Willowbrook State School or Penshurst in Pennsylvania or others where we don't really know what happened there. And I don't know that we really believe that what happened there was really wrong. And I think when we look at COVID and we look at the numbers of people dying in nursing homes and the numbers of people dying in restricted residential housing, I think we still are not, as a society, demanding that money be utilized to allow people to live in their own homes or to live, with one or two people of their choosing. We still have not really gotten what home and community-based services mean. We still haven't really gotten into thinking about, well, don't we need laws that would, even when we're building private homes, have to be accessible? What is the beauty of steps? What is the beauty of narrow doors into bathrooms? What is the beauty of so many of these things that cause people not to be able to stay in their own communities?
Mhm.
So I think there's a lot more that we need to learn. And I still feel that, people need to be looking at these issues in their 20s, 30s, 40s on up, because statistically, as you get older, you're more likely to acquire a disability where you may need some assistance, limitedly or more extensively. And one shouldn't think about having to live in a restricted, segregated environment so that you're not going to be a burden on your family.
Thank you. I'm guessing that many, many people in the audience here today have seen Crip Camp. If you haven't, you must. And a comment both on Crip Camp and on Judy's autobiography is, I found them very important lessons in community, and you really saw what community meant when you watched Crip Camp in leadership and Judy's ability and others to bring people together, to listen, to be patient, to make sure that everyone is included, everyone's voice is included, including people who have difficulty expressing it in a conventional voice. They should really use this in courses about leadership, not just putting it into the disability box. So I have a question, and then I see a couple in the chat box. And it has to do with advocacy. And it seems to me that certainly media has always been a tool in your advocacy toolbox. Back, some of you may know this, in 1970, when you were trying to get a job with the New York City School Board to teach school, and they said you couldn't teach school because you were in a wheelchair, you were a fire hazard, all kinds of cockamamie excuses. And it really turned when there was an article in the New York Times, I think, that helped change people's minds. The headline was, "Woman in Wheelchair Sues to Become a Teacher." So from a very early point, and certainly another landmark event in your life as an advocate, is the 1977 Section 504 sit-in, where Judy and a number of other people literally took over a federal building in San Francisco for 28 days and other buildings to force the federal government to actually enforce a law that ostensibly was on the books but hadn't been authorized, hadn't been funded. That got a lot of media attention. So now you seem like you are a multimedia threat these days. You've got a book, you've got Crip Camp, you now have a movie that's going to be made, you have an amazing podcast, which I also highly recommend. So how does the changing landscape of media play into advocacy today? If the Section 504 question had come up today, would there even be a need to have a sit-in, or would everybody just head for Twitter and advocate that way? So how is media changing your work as a rights advocate?
In a limited way. I think, when you have nothing, having something almost every day seems like a lot. But when you look at the breadth of the issues that impact disabled people and just who we are, the numbers of people we are, I would like to presume that when looking at advertising any place, that seeing disabled people and, in disabilities, I've been mentioning, you've got this combination of visible and invisible disabilities, and a very large percentage of people have invisible disabilities. So just showing a picture of someone who's deaf or blind, has Down syndrome, whatever, where you can notice. You also need to make sure that stories about people with invisible disabilities are being told. I would say that there's a little more consciousness, but still we have so much ground to make up. So are we moving in the right direction? Yes. Are we where we need to be? I would say not in any way, shape, or form.
But is media, let's take Crip Camp, for example, is that able to kind of educate and inform and inspire people in a way that maybe could have never happened? I don't know how many thousands of people have seen it, but certainly a lot. And I'm sure.
I would say I'm sure at least 1 million people. I may be wrong, but I'm sure it's had a huge following because it's Netflix, and because we had COVID, and because it's also on YouTube. Do I think it's making a difference? I do. But how much of a difference, I really don't know, because we've not evaluated it all.
Uh-huh.
You know, we've had many discussions. There is an impact campaign that the Jimmy Lebrecht and Nicole and Sarah Noonan, the directors and producer, decided early on they wanted to put together, and they've had a great team of people, Andrea Levant being one of them, who have been working on rolling out Crip Camp beyond just, watching it. They had a summer camp last year where every Sunday for 16 weeks, they had people who came on, mainly disabled individuals, learning about different aspects of disability, all of which is great. So I'm not criticizing any of this stuff. But the most common comment that people made when we were at Sundance, there were like 12 showings. I was at about 6 of them. After each showing, they had a Q&A and, standing ovations. And I think people were genuinely moved, as you were saying, from the film. And the question was, how come we didn't know this story?
Mm-hmm.
And I heard that so often. I finally started saying, well, you're the filmmakers. You do documentaries. You're the people who watch documentaries. How come this story wasn't told? It's not that people haven't seen us on the street, haven't seen some things about what are going on. I think in order for Crip Camp to make the change that we want, I think Crip Camp is a fantastic movie. It allows people a little bit more awareness. But the issue then is, what do you do with that knowledge? How are you changing your personal life? What questions are you asking in your daily life? Do you have a disability that you haven't disclosed? Why haven't you disclosed it? Are there people in your immediate family or circle of friends who may have disabilities? Have you ever spoken to them? When we look at the number of homeless people in the United States and countries around the world, the vast majority of those people have disabilities. Have we spoken with them? What changes are we making in our lives, in our religious life, in our businesses, in our neighborhoods? And I think people also, in many ways, are still at this level of, what do I call you? And one of the reasons why I really want to be done with other people looking at what they should call me is because when they're using the word able, to me, it means there's something about the word able. It's a powerful word, I guess. And you don't want me to think of myself as being disabled because it's negative. And it's difficult for people to see, I don't see disabled as negative. But I do feel very much that we've got to get beyond, and I'm not saying we shouldn't discuss it, because I know it's something that we need to discuss. I was in Vietnam when I worked for the World Bank. We had just given this presentation on the work that I was doing as the advisor in the World Bank. And this young guy, probably in his 20s, who was Vietnamese, said to me, what should I call you? Well, first of all, that kind of a question being asked in Vietnam really shows how this issue of, what do I call you? And he did his work in English, but people were calling me Judith and Judy. The president called me Judith and my friends called me Judy. So I actually thought he was asking me that question. Should I call you Judy or Judith? And I said, oh, you can call me either Judy or Judith. And then he said to me, no, do I call you disabled? Do I call you the able disabled? Do I call you? And he gave all these words. And I said to him, I really hope you were listening to what I was saying about what we need to do. And, I think for some reason, people frequently get caught up in, what do I call you? Not, let's sit down and have a discussion and look about what are things that you're experiencing in your life and what do we need to do in order to change those experiences. It doesn't get to that level of discussion anywhere near as frequently as it does. What term should we use?
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions coming up in the chat box. One going back to the theme of the role and responsibility of Jewish institutions, synagogues, and others. So this is a question from Ellen Levitt, who is with the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington Inclusion Group. So right there in your part of the country. And he asks, what strategies, what activities do you think are most effective in trying to motivate, educate, guilt, or whatever that will impact leadership, boards of synagogues, and other organizations to make their facilities and their activities more welcoming to people with disabilities?
I'll answer that in 1 second. In the chat, someone has written, could the person doing the captioning please spell Crip Camp correctly?
Oh,
So for the captioner, Crip Camp is spelled C-R-I-P, C-R-I-P, Camp, C-A-M-P.
Hmm.
So it's Crip, not crap.
I think it's an auto caption, Judy.
Just jumping in here, that we use a
Auto captioning.
intelligence software to provide our captions. So I'm sorry it's not 100% accurate. We'll make sure that the transcript after the program says Crip.
Okay,
It's
thank
not
you,
intelligent
Anna.
enough. So thanks for pointing that out, Judy. So the question of what can synagogues do constructively, proactively to be more accessible, be more inviting, be more open?
I think there needs to be working groups in the shuls which are discussing these issues that should be composed of majority disabled people. I think disabled people should be on the boards. And I think there needs to be learning opportunities because people are really not only wanting the synagogues to be accessible, and by that I mean for deaf people and blind people, people with autism, various forms of physical disabilities, and something which becomes a natural way of doing things. So we make sure that our bemas are accessible, that our prayer books are accessible. COVID is a great example of how we have not really been prepared to have captioning on a regular basis or sign language interpreters for people who may wish to come and participate in religious life. We need to really look also at Jewish teachings. And, you know, I would not put myself forward at all on looking at the Torah, etc. But there are many places where disability is discussed in a way that at first blush looks like we are being considered in a lesser category than non-disabled people. There are more and more rabbis with disabilities who are really very knowledgeable. Ari Regan and many others, I think, you know, really looking to the disabled religious community who are working on inclusion of disabled people across the board. They need to be playing a more prominent role. I think the Jewish federations, you know, continuing to really step up and making sure that the camps are accessible, that services are being provided in a way that people wish them to be provided. And I think, you know, it's very important as I talk about, you know, people acquiring their disabilities as they get older. We need to look at a way that we can ensure that older people or younger people, depending, who may have previously been active but no longer can be for whatever reason, that we look at ways beyond just visiting people at home, but we look at ways of getting people, if they wish, to be able to come into synagogues for lectures or religious services, whatever it may be. We need to make sure that people continue to feel connected. When I worked at the Department of Education, in the 1990s, there had been a grant that had been awarded through our Rehabilitation Services Office, looking at which businesses did the best job on getting employees who had been working in a company and then became injured and did not go off on disability insurance, but stayed in the workforce. And how did that happen? So Coors was the company that came in best because they had a requirement that managers had to stay in regular contact with people who had become disabled. And that if those people did not return back to work, it was something that could adversely affect the manager. Now, there's something very valuable about that because the company wanted to make sure that the workers felt valued and that the changes that were going on in their lives were something that the company wanted to address and to help, if possible, for the person to come back to work. Now, that's the same thing for people who've been active, in this case, in the Jewish community. If it's something that was a part of someone's life and they can't participate anymore and because of various barriers, we need to work on those barriers. But I think the most important thing is get disabled people on the board, hire disabled people within the staff of the synagogues, make it known, not just once a month or once a year for a month, that we're looking at issues around disability and really be open to looking at simple changes and more significant changes. So at Addis, we've had every year a speaker who will come in. Most of them have had various forms of disabilities, but not everyone, to talk about their experiences. And they haven't even, we had one non-Jewish person who came in who did interfaith work and she was great. But there were quite a number of rabbis that have come in and they've been great. And I think it's really intentional learning.
Mhm.
And also, I think with our social justice committees, we need to make sure that disability is not something which is always seen separate. But if you look at the work that goes on in social justice, whether it's around immigrants or around homelessness or around violence against disabled women, whatever the topic may be, disabled people are a part of all of that. And so we really need to make sure it's quite understood that disability is across the board.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, we've talked a lot about language today. So this word intersectionality has come into the lexicon in the
Yes.
past few years. And I know, as you just spoke to, understanding the linkage. Ultimately, this is all about justice with a capital J, whether it's racial justice, gender justice, disability justice, and so forth. So not looking at things too narrowly or not deeply enough. I think interesting, the whole discussion on language today, and your point and the point of some of the commentators in the chat is let's move beyond the discussion of this
Yes.
label or that label to what are we really saying. So I want to pick up one other question that's come up. It relates back to kind of a Holocaust question, I guess, but it also relates to this notion of kind of connecting the dots. And the question, which comes from Ari Goldstein of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, is there, how can we use Holocaust education, which is well established in many school systems and certainly also as an avenue to talk about disability and disability rights, certainly directly as to what happened in the early days of the Holocaust, as you mentioned, with children, but also more broadly, what are the takeaways from that to today? So is there an opportunity to kind of create those linkages between different ideas that first seem different, but then you put them together and say, okay, now I see the deeper meaning here, the different events over history that form patterns?
Yes, I think we're talking about injustice and using the Holocaust as an example. So certainly when teaching about the Holocaust, we really need to look at the issue of who are the first people being killed, who are the people that were being, people being experimented on. We need to look at that seriously. We also need to look at when we talk about injustice against different communities, we need to make sure that injustice against disabled people is a part of the teaching that we're giving. I just think that when children are learning about our Holocaust and others where lives are not being valued, we need to really be raising those points. And I think really right now with COVID as an example, it's a perfect example of talking about how disabled people's lives have not been valued. I think, when working with children, it's important for them to really be allowed to express what their views are around disabled people, what they think, what they've learned, making sure that disability is integrated into children's books, with pictures of disabled people, disabled children in those books, having teachers who are working in our schools who have disabilities, where disability is naturally a part of what's going on, and really consciously bringing people in who may have disabilities who can talk about issues around disability and Judaism and what needs to be done. We were talking, Ari, about a very good book that came out a couple of years ago looking at integration and Judaism as the type of book that I think could very effectively be used in doing work on a Holocaust education, because it allows people to really look more deeply at what some of the issues are that disabled people have been discussing and confronting. And just that you have the right people involved in preparing curricula and presenting that information will enable this issue to be addressed more appropriately.
So one brief question, I know we're coming up on the end of the hour, and then maybe one a little bit longer. So President Biden will certainly, if nothing else, be remembered as a president with a visible disability, similar, I guess, to FDR. Based on what you've seen so far, he's only been in office 6 months, do you think he will go down in history as an important president in disability rights? Will he use the bully pulpit? Will he advocate and use his budget proactively and so on? Is he going to be great, good, mediocre, disappointing president in terms of disability rights?
Well, of course, I'm going to say great, or hopefully great. He's 6 months in, and I think he's demonstrating his commitment to disability through things like the home and community-based services legislation, where they're advocating for $400 billion to be spent on this issue. It's one of the major issues that disabled people have been asking for increased funding, which will enable waiting lists to be taken away and enable people opportunities to live in the community, to move out of nursing homes, be prevented from going into nursing homes. They're beginning to be appointing people to different jobs who are respected in the field, who will be involved in really helping to implement laws that my husband just came in the foyer. So yes, the answer is, I think he will go down as a president who in fact really did commit to disability. His coming out as a stutterer, I think really was very important. And certainly for stutterers around the United States and around the world, was really a major statement, and one which enabled him to combat other people saying that he was stumbling and fumbling. And it was his intellectual prowess that was really coming forward to being able to say, no, he was a stutterer, and this is, how you deal with it.
Thank you. So one other question. Sunday's New York Times, the business section, there was a profile of a woman named Crystal Bailey. She has spina bifida and has used a wheelchair since she was a young child. She now works as a vocational rehabilitation counselor in the Bronx, helping people with disabilities achieve the employment goals that they define not the goals that other people define for them. And in the article, which was actually more of a graphic presentation, not conventional, she was quoted as saying, quote, "I don't think our society is more open to people with disabilities now. I just think we're more in your face." Do you agree with that? Disagree? Want to shade it a little bit?
I don't disagree at all. I mean, I think it's fair to say that when getting back to one of your earlier questions about media, it's not that media on its own woke up one morning and said, oh, you know, guys, we're not representing disabled people enough. It really was very much that disabled people are organizing. Like there's a group that's being set up of disabled journalists. There's an organization being created of disabled people who are documentary filmmakers. There's lots of different work that's being done to advance, you know, the inclusion of disabled people. And the time, I think, is such right now that there's more openness to it. But really, as I was also saying earlier, when I speak to these major companies and talk to their ERGs and whatever else they call them, I think it's still fair to say that the good news is these groups are forming. And the good news is these groups are struggling to figure out how to get the companies to really be doing what they want them to do, both for the employees and for the customer base. And so, yes, we are definitely moving forward, but it wouldn't be happening without the community itself, really. And some of the studies, like Accenture's study on diversity and showing that diversity improves the bottom line for companies, and disability is something that was included in their review. So I think what we're seeing is what we have been saying when it's implemented is really beginning to show people that what we've been saying is right. Inclusion is what it's about.
Thank you, Judy, for being here today and sharing your thoughts, and for the work you've done and the work you continue to do. It's exciting to hear that you're able to influence corporations, large corporations with 30,000 employees. I know people in the government and in institutions like the World Bank are always interested in what you have to say. Keep it up. I said at the outset that I always learn from Judy in every conversation we have, and that is true yet again today. I've got a couple of pages of notes to prove it, and just trying to think about kind of what are the key words that I'm taking away. Others may be different. So the whole discussion around language, not just labels, but the deeper meaning of language and the way we understand each other and talk about each other and about respect. About
I mean, one thing that I want people to take away
yeah.
is that there are so many people in your immediate environments that are doing work either in their own personal life or with organizations who have disabilities, who are parents of kids who have disabilities, whatever. And really, you know, talk with people, listen to people, learn from people, commit to working together on making change. You know, I've got this blip in time where I'm getting a reasonable amount of attention, but there's so many other people there who are so knowledgeable and are doing such great work that, you know, we really need to continue to expand our universe of those people that we're bringing in to learn from and to listen to.
Thank you. So I guess that's a perfect way to end. It's not just a question of what can Judy Heumann do, but what can each one of the 100+ people on this webinar do now? What actions can we take to promote justice and rights for all people, regardless of skin color, ability, disability, the whole gamut. It's about what can each of us do. And so thank you all again. And Ari, I think you want to have a few closing remarks.
Just a brief thank you on behalf of the museum, Judy, for sharing your story and reflections in your career with us, Bill, for being our host and moderator, and thank you as well to Audrey Bastian for being our sign language interpreter today. This conversation is so important and to be continued. We hope all of you will join us for upcoming museum programs and donate and become members of the museum if you're able to support our essential work. We wish everyone a great afternoon, and we'll be in touch tomorrow with a recording of today's discussion, a link to order Judy's excellent book, Being Heumann, and some other resources. Take care.
And
everyone.
Rolling Warrior for younger kids.
All right.
We'll include it.
That one.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
I thank you all.